This is the Tory Leadership Election podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home. Welcome to the 7th Conservative Home Tory Leadership Election podcast, and this is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, with Mark Wallace, the executive editor of Conservative Home. Now, we usually start, we've done the previous 6 podcasts, by looking back at Boris Johnson's week and Jeremy Hunt's week. But this week, we have to do something different because we need to ask, has Boris Johnson already won? Since last week, we've had a YouGov poll the very day after our last podcast, which showed him on 74% of the vote. We ourselves have done another survey showing him rising from 67% to 72% of the vote, with an overall turnout of about 71% of the vote. So Mark, at this point, I'm going to turn to you because you are the turnout wizard. On the one hand, we've got Conservative Home, senior cabinet ministers, senior members of the voluntary party and campaign organisers saying, well, the turnout is nearer to your figure of about 70%. On the other hand, we have a whole spate of reports which appeared immediately after our report of the 70% turnout saying, oh, well, it could be as low as a third or maybe below half. So can you cast any light on the mystery of the turnout and whether Boris has already won?
Hopefully we can cast a little bit of light by looking through some of the facts, but also considering how voters actually behave and particularly how this race is being run. And so I agree with you. I don't think it's a coincidence with your implication that these leaked estimates or leaked numbers suddenly came out after we published our survey figure on Thursday morning. Part of that is that because basically everybody's interest at the moment, whether you're Team Johnson, Team Hunt or CCHQ, the Conservative Party's actual organisation itself, all of their interests are kind of aligned in making sure that people don't get disillusioned and depressed and disengaged or complacent and cocky and don't bother voting. Both candidates obviously want to maximise their vote, and the party itself wants to really make sure that it can produce a high turnout, not least because it's told us that there will be a high turnout at the start of this race, but also because it wants to imbue the new Prime Minister, the new leader, with as much of a mandate as you can get from a party-only leadership election. So I think that's the context in all of this, which should, I think, add a little pinch of salt to some of these really low-ball numbers. I don't think, there have been some allegations that these figures of less than a third or less than half are somehow just untrue. They're being issued with an agenda being kind of made up. I simply don't think that's the case. These are, whether you're talking about Beth Rigby at Sky, Laura Kuenssberg at the BBC, Francis Elliott at the Times, these are reputable professional journalists who will be reporting accurately what they are being told by good, interesting, informed sources. The question is, what kind of data is this? When's it from? And what is it looking at? Is it looking at something the same as our survey, or is it looking at something different? And effectively, you've got to remember this is a postal ballot. This is the crucial element of all this. So when we did our survey during the course of Wednesday into first thing Thursday morning, there will be people within our survey panel who've answered that and said, yes, I voted, who had just put their ballot in the post, who, the Royal Mail being what it is, the Conservative Party's electoral administrators will now have received that ballot paper. They'll now be separating it out from the personal data included, they'll now be adding to a tally, and then they'll go on to report it to CCHQ. It seems that these reports to CCHQ are the source of these figures of rather lower turnouts. And the question is, what does that represent? Effectively, if you've got a CCHQ report that was compiled on Wednesday, you're talking about people who put their vote in the post on Tuesday, maybe Monday. By contrast, those reports won't reflect the full number of people who voted on Wednesday, who put on our survey. They won't appear on CCHQ's numbers until Friday or possibly today, Saturday. So that, I think, is the primary thing that's probably going on.
Basically, there's a time lag between CCHQ, for so it is, hearing the reports and what's actually happening out there in the real world. You have to say at the end of all that, when you take the YouGov into account, after all, the YouGov is a fully fledged opinion poll, it all does look very good for Boris Johnson.
We've also, of course, got to look at whether the Conservative Home numbers might be slightly overstating turnout in the same way that I think some of these slightly older official figures might be understating it. It's undoubtedly the case that if you're a Conservative Home reader, you're on our survey panel, you're likely to be more engaged than the average Conservative Party member, and that people responding to a survey, by definition, won't include those people who are ill or off on holiday, etc. So there are some reasons to think that our number of 71% might be a little bit high. But when you look at comparing it to, say, YouGov's polling, we reliably and regularly find very, very similar results to them in terms of Conservative Party opinion. So I think it's quite easy sometimes to assume that the survey must be so self-selecting that it simply isn't accurate. But actually, we've got good reasons to think it's quite reliable. But we need to be a little bit honest. We need to be honest in our scrutiny of it and say maybe it's overstating a bit. It seems entirely likely to me that figures of less than a third or really down there are understating by a lot. And actually that realistically in a couple of days' time, I think the official turnout figure will probably start to reflect the number that we know have been posted.
On which point, let's look back over the last week on one area that almost no one has written or talked about or really probed, which is the ground war. We'll talk in a minute about the ITV debate this week and about the Andrew Neil interrogation, which is going to happen tonight as we speak, Friday evening, and about some of next week. But there's a ground war going on, is there not, by both the Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson campaigns. And what's your take on that?
One of the things we've talked about in previous episodes of this podcast has been the fact that actually the Boris Johnson campaign in particular has been heavily influenced by what went wrong with the previous Boris Johnson campaign, namely charges of disorganisation, lack of preparation, lack of proper structure. That was one of the reasons that Michael Gove cited back in 2016 for abandoning the Johnson camp. And they've learned the lessons of that last war. So we've seen a proper campaign structure in terms of its communications and advice and close media management that those people have complained about at the top. We're also seeing a grassroots machine appear around the country. They have local organisers, they have area and regional organisers, they have people phone banking who've been ringing up, for example, producing this figure this week of 1,500 councillors support Boris Johnson. That's the product of people writing to and phoning up thousands and thousands of Conservative councillors around the country. When you're phoned to ask about your support, if you give it or you've already voted for Boris Johnson, they have other things to ask of you. They'd like you to contact other people you know to help join the Get Out the Vote campaign. They'd like you to help spread their messages. This is a leadership campaign that seems to be operating in a very similar manner to how a political party would operate, particularly the Conservative Party would operate its campaigns, in part for the good reason that some of the people running it are people from, say, Crosby, Textor, Fulbrook, who've run Conservative Party general election campaigns in the past. I mean, you've seen, obviously the Hunt campaign are doing stuff like this as well. You've seen some of this, I think, in action at Hustings.
I'm very struck by two things. I mean, one is that doing what we do, you see a certain amount from your desk at Con Home anyway. So I'm vaguely aware of things that the Hunt campaign do that the Johnson campaign don't do. So, for example, on the way to this podcast, I saw that the Hunt campaign had been quicker off the mark in responding to a request for a particular view from one of the One Nation groups. But on the whole, I have to say, looking at the stuff that comes in, the Boris Johnson ground war seems to be quite meticulously organised. You get these statements from councillors for Johnson. You get these statements from parliamentary candidates for Johnson. My sense from behind the desk is there's more of it from them. We're being offered more pieces, more articles from the Johnson kind of campaign. And there's no doubt that his supporters really are putting their back into it. Then yesterday evening, that's Thursday as broadcasters are listening to this, Andrew Jimson and I went down to Maidstone to see the hustings there in Kent. And I would have said that the group of supporters who welcomed Boris Johnson when he arrived was bigger than the group of supporters that welcomed Jeremy Hunt when he arrived. I thought they both did perfectly okay in the hall. applause for Boris Johnson was slightly more emphatic, probably not a lot in it. But there was sort of, evidence of organisation from both campaigns. But, the Johnson campaign seemed, on the whole, to be more numerous. I would add a rider. There's an awful lot of, pro-Jeremy Hunt MPs had turned up to support him. So I saw, this is all off the top of my head, trying to remember, Roger Gale was there, Nuz Ghani was there, Damien Green, who's a Boris Johnson supporter now, was there. So on the whole, there was sort of, I thought, sort of more at the Jeremy Hunt end, and they had a sort of quite a noisy little group that whooped, but I thought the whooping was really making up for sort of more Johnson applause. So, but on the business of the ground war, I really think the sort of the Johnson campaign is kind of grinding it out.
It's got to be said that there's also a technical reason why so much activity is happening so intently. That while there is a spending limit on the campaign, as I understand it, it's also the case that if a campaign has money left in their budget at the end, then that money goes to the Conservative Party, effectively goes into CCHQ's coffers. So it's in the interests, dare I say, of literally everybody involved to make sure that if there's meticulous work to be done within a budget, within a spending limit, that actually it's done and it's funded.
Just sort of stepping back from the ground war for a moment, of course, this week it was said that the big chance Jeremy Hunt had to move the dial, and the message from the Hunt campaign early this week very much was, don't vote yet, wait to see the debate and sort of see how it goes. Obviously, they invested a lot of hope in that debate. I mean, when I saw it, I really didn't think either of the contenders landed a sort of knockout blow. My sense of it was sort of that on the first section, the Europe section, because Boris Johnson's position is kind of cleaner, we will leave on October 31st, come what may, I thought he had the better of the argument, because Jeremy Hunt's case, whether you believe it or not, whether you agree with it or not, is a more complex one to put. And Boris Johnson landed some counterpunches. On the second half, my impression was that Jeremy won that. I thought that he made a lot of Boris Johnson's failure clearly to answer questions, and that by the end of it, although Jeremy Hunt's not the most forceful debater in the world, he's perfectly clear and competent, and he'd scored, in my view, some points.
Yes, and I think you could see that start to have an impact on how Boris Johnson was communicating in the debate. It was influencing the way in which he was acting, and once you start to influence or even dictate the behaviour of your opponent in any kind of contest, evidently something you're doing is starting to work. That said, there's still that difficulty for Jeremy Hunt, that if, like the Hunt campaign, you believe that there are still all these votes up for grabs, just discussed whether that is necessarily the case or not, you have this constant challenge that's been there since the start, that hasn't gone away, that your personality and your proposal for why you'd be a good Prime Minister were all rooted in responsibility, professionalism, and so on and so on. Being collegiate, being a good colleague, all things which are entirely true about Jeremy Hunt. But the medium you're communicating in, the context of being up against somebody who is is quite a dominant figure in the race going into it, when you go into it in second place, requires you to stick your elbows out, put your head down and start barging in. And so you had some of this personal attack stuff that will have pleased people who really dislike Boris Johnson, but I'm not sure it will have satisfied some of those members who have always been concerned that this race would end up being about blue on blue attacks. It was quite interesting, a little bit jarring with Jeremy Hunt's persona and his position and his promise that some of the stuff he was doing was a bit more personal. It raised some eyebrows.
This is a very interesting theme. I mean, as I say, I thought that in the debate, Jeremy Hunt, as it were, either needed to land a knockout blow, or Boris Johnson needed to make some terrible blooper. I mean, literally to say, do you know what, folks? I've been thinking, and Jeremy Corbyn would make a great Prime Minister. Or, you know what? I've come round to believing in a federal Europe. I thought unless Boris made some terrible mistake of that kind, or unless Jeremy Hunt really dominated the debate, it probably wouldn't make much of a difference, and that still is, for better or worse, is my take. I'm quite interested in this business of whether or not Jeremy Hunt has been hitting Boris Johnson too hard, and what the consequences of that might be. I think it's quite difficult. On the one hand, the worry about Jeremy Hunt in some quarters at the start of this contest was that he'd be a patsy. It'd be much better for the contest if you put up someone with the oratorical and debating skills of Michael Gove. On the other hand, he's now been, in one or two instances, so personal about Boris Johnson, you're calling him a coward, for example, early on in the contest. There is kind of some discussion in the sort of Boris Johnson quarters of what on earth they're going to do with him if Boris Johnson wins. Is it, if you've had someone who's got this close and personal, is it impossible to give them a great office of state or make them deputy leader or whatever? My point of view, for what it's worth, again, is that Boris Johnson, if he wins, is going to lose so many people from his top table, the Philip Hammonds, the David Lidingtons, the David Gawks, the Ken Clarks. I think he's going to need people like Jeremy Hunt, who are more centre-left of the party. If they will sign up to his policy of leaving on October the 31st, I think he's got to treat them pretty well.
As Amber Rudd appears to have done,
Indeed.
Notably. And that's one person who you might have, there were various rumours early on that she might even be some kind of running mate for a Johnson campaign, and then she came out on the other side, came out elsewhere in the early stages. Now she seems to be out there clarifying some of her position exactly on no deal, why it's useful, why it's important to have as a weapon in an armoury, and she agrees in that sense. There is that question simply of lineup, and I think when Jeremy Hunt has managed to, he certainly made himself better known in this process, and like you say, he's actually surprised some people when he promised that he would give Boris Johnson the fight of his life. There were a few people who kind of laughed into their handkerchiefs, I think, about whether that was necessarily going to be the case. He's definitely given the fight of Jeremy Hunt's life. I mean, he's outperformed what people might have expected in that. But the simple question is, can you put him in? Can you put him in that top team? For that matter, I think it'd be very difficult to keep him as Foreign Secretary at this point. And he is somebody who has a track record of telling a Prime Minister who wants to move him, no, I won't take the job that you want because it's not good enough for me. He did that to Theresa May. So in some ways, he might be growing, effectively growing in stature to become an awkward figure.
Let's carry on looking ahead to the future, since that's just where the conversation's gone. When we were sitting here last week, we said, well, maybe there'll be a poll tomorrow. And indeed there was. There was the YouGov poll. And we said, you never know what the Sunday papers are going to bring. I mean, I'll be very interested to see whether there's another poll tomorrow. And of course, the question of the Sunday papers really takes us to the whole Kim Darroch business over the last week. And now, you can't think of anything, in a way, less like the story of Boris Johnson's domestic tiff with Carrie Symonds on the recording. Can't think of anything less like it than the story of another leak of someone saying something, which is the Darroch tapes. But both have produced very strong attacks on Boris Johnson that have reminded one how many people really don't want him to win. Yeah? And I'm wondering if in the Sunday papers we're going to see more of that, and consequently, more pressure brought to bear on the front runner.
Indeed, I think we almost certainly will. We've heard the sheer strength and intensity of some of those criticisms, I think, has been not surprising, given where it's come from in a few cases. But actually, I think I'd question whether it's been entirely wise. Actually, some of it has smacked of a bit of desperation. Some of, I think, Alan Duncan's dash to the airwaves, but probably didn't really help Jeremy Hunt, for example. And actually, in some ways, would have insulated Johnson. This leak story might not be over. It was the other thing to consider. There's a lot of speculation swirling around Westminster that Isabel Oakeshott might have more of these documents, be it from the same source of the same cache, or be it from the same source or from different original ambassadors. So there's always the potential this will keep going, whether it's from her, whether there's just now more of a lobby appetite for stories like this once you've broken open this kind of taboo. So that in itself will put some pressure on Boris Johnson, because he was attacked for doing what he felt to be the kind of responsible thing and standing back from getting personally involved in what is effectively Jeremy Hunt's department, by being contrasted very starkly with Jeremy Hunt's kind of unequivocal support for the ambassador. That in itself puts a demand on Boris Johnson. Actually, if something now happens, all the expectation will be that he will actually have to be more emphatic than he perhaps could have got away with being in the debate earlier this week. So it raises the stakes, and it puts more pressure on him. Well, it's got to be said, yet again, even when it's an awkward story, who are the headlines about?
Boris Johnson. And I think that just as he got through the domestic row story without apparently damaging his position as the front runner, I think so he's got through this. And there's a certain view that says, well, the leak was a terrible business, but once it had happened, sooner or later, the ambassador was always going to go. I'm very conscious that as we're making this broadcast, listeners will be hearing it tomorrow morning. They're hearing us talking ahead about the Sunday papers and, whatever they might hold for Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson. But between us speaking now and them hearing our voices tomorrow morning comes Andrew Neil, right, tearing into both of them tonight on TV. And I would have thought Andrew Neil, for the political enthusiasts who are watching, is capable of doing more damage to both Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt than any number of newspaper stories of a more remote kind.
So there's a very good reason why politicians are fearful of being grilled by Andrew Neil, and why everybody else loves watching Andrew Neil grilling politicians, which is that he doesn't pull his punches, he does his research in huge amounts of detail. He's notorious that before doing Politics Live or something, you can see him sitting in a cafe near to the studio with researchers, with his documents, going through line by line for hours exactly what he's going to be talking about with different journalists. With different politicians. That's exactly why it's really important and really good that this is happening, because you need someone who isn't just an interviewer, they're an inquisitor. And I think a lot of people will be very interested to see that. Ironically, if it is the case that most votes have already been cast, this could be something that has a big influence on the next government, less than who the next Prime Minister is, but what their actual time in office is like. If somebody can land real punches, it's him.
It's possible to argue that the real gainer from the Andrew Neil interviews, and this is just the way things are, will be all the Conservative Party's political opponents. Because, and I will sit here next week and can be proved to be wrong, I suspect what Andrew Neil will do, it has to do really, is try to get at and probe and test the character of both the contenders. So the danger for Jeremy Hunt will be that Andrew Neil's line of inquiry will be, you flip-flop, can't rely on you. And that his attack on Boris Johnson will be, can't rely on you either, because your character is fundamentally unreliable. And if he doesn't do something like that with both these men, I'll be quite surprised.
Yeah, and I think if you look at, say, Hunt, the natural answer you'd give as Jeremy Hunt on paper, if you're looking at your strengths and weaknesses list, to say, well, you think I flip-flop, you think I'm not determined, look at my experience facing down the junior doctors' strikes. That demonstrates strength, it demonstrates grit and steel, but it doesn't necessarily endear voters to you, which is part of the difficulty. I say, listen, I did something, in some ways making a little bid for a kind of Thatcher position where you want people to say, so I might not have agreed with what they did, what he did, but he stood up for what he believed. It's an awkward thing to do, and it's something that actually I think, interestingly, the Hunt campaign has always had very clean answers on, because they know that it's a major part of his reputation. But I'm not sure they've ever had necessarily very convincing answers about.
And Boris Johnson, what do you think are the problems for him in the Andrew Neil interrogation?
Well, we've only got about half an hour for the podcast, so it depends how long a list you want to go into. People, the difficulty is a little bit like Jeremy Corbyn in some ways. there's this question of are these things priced in? Are they factored in? They've got a backstory or a list of different previous stories and controversies and claims and counterclaims and things that people might like or dislike about somebody. Are they completely priced in? Well, often that seems to be the case. But is Neil really, as you say, is he going to actually be able to pick them all up, resurrect them, and turn them into a narrative? And will Johnson be able to actually answer them? Will he be able to front up to them? I think there's quite a lot of people within his target electorate who would cheer him on if he basically said, well, you're repeating all this stuff. That isn't what people are interested in. People are interested in what I'm going to do, not all this kind of nonsense and bat it straight back. But it's a risky thing to do.
When I saw him at Maidstone, I thought that the only way of interpreting what he was doing was that he thinks he'd won. He was much more relaxed. There were more jokes. There were more Borisisms. It was much more like the old Boris rather than the sort of slightly more scripted one we've seen recently. So someone asked him a question in which they somehow managed to combine animal welfare and the royal yacht. And you can imagine what Boris Johnson made of that. But he's going to have to be on the top of his game, right, to get through Andrew Neil without, whether it has any wider consequences or not, Andrew Neil knocking spots off him.
Yes, there's part of this. Part of the danger is that you've almost got an Olympic gymnast performing, and actually, or you're trying to do a gymnastic performance at the Olympics. Can you just do it in showmanship? No, you've got to have the underlying athleticism. You've got to actually perform the moves, do all the twists and tumbles, and then stick the landing. You want to do all the flourishes on top? That's great, but a judge who knows what they're talking about, who knows you as a performer, can cut straight through and say, right, stop the waving around or curlicues on this. Can you answer the basic question at the heart of what I'm asking? And unless he fronts up to that, he's going to get pinned down by it.
Anyway, but this time tomorrow, we will know what Andrew Neil's made of both of these men. By this time next week, we will know, listeners will know, what was in the Sunday papers and whether it was of any consequence. And we'll have had a whole further week of campaigning. So we'll be back to discuss all that next week, and I'm looking forward to it a lot.